Hi guys, my name is Stacy. I will be working with the other Stacy in the class. Discussion is on juveniles incarcerated in adult prisons, tried as adults, and the negative effects that come of that. There has been a lot of debate over the appropriate way to treat juvenile offenders within the criminal justice system. It's actually become a central theme in policy discussion domestically as well as internationally. The United States makes up only 5% of the world's population, yet it incarcerates 25% of all prisoners worldwide, many of which are children. Our international human rights law defines children as persons 18 years or younger. The United States is one of the only nations to charge children in criminal court and incarcerate them in adult facilities. According to the ACLU, the United States is also the only country in the world to sentence children to life in prison, use solitary confinement, and even execute them on rare occasions. Adult jails and prisons that house these adolescents face significant obstacles to keeping adolescents safe and ensuring that they receive developmentally appropriate services, because these facilities are typically, they're designed to manage adults. This includes limited.
The thought of having so many young men, particularly on Rikers Island in solitary confinement, is extremely distressing to me. It is a remarkable fact that 27% of the adolescents on Rikers Island are in solitary confinement. It is more than 10 times the normal utilization of in solitary confinement in the United States. And I don't know that those numbers are reasonable, but it is off the curve. Most of these people have not been convicted of anything or certainly sentenced. The reason that most of them are in jail is because they can't afford bail. Some have said that this is not really segregation. It's not like the federal maximum security units. But I've been to supermax prisons, and I've been to Rikers Island, and it is quite similar. The American Academy of Adolescent and Child Psychiatry says you cannot put adolescents in solitary confinement. And there are prisons and jail systems throughout the world with taking care of populations comparable to ours that don't use solitary confinement. But yet the first day as the board member, I met with the warden at the adolescent facility. I said, so what are you doing? How can this be improved? And they said, more solitary confinement.
So my main concern is the use of solitary confinement. I want to see those facilities, and I want to be able to talk to people who are in isolation. The number of people in solitary confinement in the United States is by far the largest in the world. In legal terms, the Convention on the Rights of the Child specifically says that solitary confinement for young offenders is prohibited. It's prohibited as a matter of international law. And it's not capricious. It's because the medical and the psychiatric literature demonstrates that young offenders suffer isolation in very different and much worse forms than adults.
A, volition, and B, culpability, their capacity to change and develop, and their psychological needs. The most dramatic difference between the brains of teens and young adults is the development of the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is responsible for things like cognitive processing, such as planning, organizing, strategizing, and organizing thoughts and actions. This part of the brain is linked to the ability to inhibit impulses, weigh consequences of decisions, prioritize, and again, strategize. As a result, teens' decision-making processes are shaped by impulsivity, immaturity, and an underdeveloped ability to fear or appreciate consequences and resist their environmental pressures.
Imagine if your next door neighbor was putting their child into a small room for 5 or 6 hours a day as a consequence for their behavior. And basically that's isolation. Now imagine the response of the neighbors around them, or you, if that's what your neighbor was doing. I am sure you'd be calling the police, you'd be calling protective services, because that's abuse. Now, apply the same rule to the same response to institutions where that happens days, weeks, months at a time. How come we don't apply that same value to the kids in the juvenile hall? What's changed? They're still children. We're still isolating them.
So as Other Stacy was talking about, the significant psychological differences between adolescents and adults makes the use of solitary confinement a lot more restrictive and a lot more damaging. Adolescents don't have the same psychological resources that adults do, and they're less equipped to manage the stress and discomfort of isolation. In particular, as the UN has stated, it's considered torture and harmful practices. It also exacerbates mental disabilities and makes otherwise mentally capable children, it causes them extreme amounts of harm. The psychological ramifications of the use of solitary is significant levels of anxiety and discomfort, trauma, abuse and neglect are compounded, thoughts of suicide and self-harm, visual and auditory hallucinations, depression, acute anxiety, shifting sleep patterns, nightmares and traumatic memories, and uncontrollable anger or rage, aggressive behavior, cutting, self-mutilation, just to name a few. So the question of how we ended up in this situation as a nation is a pretty interesting one. The 1990s, there was a huge spike in juvenile crime, and public opinion was marred by certain campaigns to instill fear and fear to the public in general. Previous to that, transferring a case from juvenile to criminal court was a lot more difficult. So the concept of the super predator to be a radically impulsive, brutally remorseless child who has no respect for human life, no moral compass, and is godless was widely spread around the 90s. This led to a change in laws that made it a lot easier to charge children as adults and basically treat them the exact same way as we treat violent adult offenders. Although we know, as Other Stacy was telling us, that their mental capacities are completely different, which makes them a lot more vulnerable to their surroundings and more prone to adapt to the criminal behavior that they witness in law.
A young juvenile criminal who is so impulsive, so remorseless, that he can kill, rape, maim without giving it a second thought.
The prediction was terrifying, and lawmakers cracked down on juvenile offenders.
This country went into a moral panic over super predators.
That the country writ large was going to hell in a handbasket. No one had a clear idea of what to do.
Political scientist John DiIulio taught at Princeton University and had done extensive research in prisons studying the criminal justice system. From 1984 to 1994, when Sandifer was killed, teenage homicide rates had more than doubled. DiIulio looked at studies that estimated that by 2000, there would be 1 million more teens between the ages of 14 and 17, and he predicted crime rates would snowball even more.
Over super predators.
You'd have a doubling or a tripling in the rate of youth violence in the time between the mid-90s and up to through mid-2000s.
Perhaps most troubling to DiIulio was what he saw as an indication that the small percentage of kids who commit the most violent crimes would be much more destructive than the generation before them.
Studies found that essentially 6% of every male youth cohort was responsible for about 50% of all the violent crimes committed by that cohort. That small fraction of people is going to be able to wreak incredible havoc.
DiIulio wasn't the only one predicting a surge in crime.
By the year 2005, we may very well have a bloodbath of teenage violence.
The term super predator originated from an inmate who said, as almost a throwaway line, he said, "Yo, these kids, they're stone cold predators."
And like a match to a flame, the word caught on.
Super predator, predator, predators, super predator.
Even more. We're talking about a group of kids who are growing up essentially fatherless, godless, and jobless.
Lawmakers seized the moment to spur on the overhaul of a legal system they considered too lax.
Kids that once stole hubcaps now rape and murder. No fear of punishment. Experts call them super predators.
There are no violent offenses that are juvenile. You rape somebody, you're an adult. You shoot somebody, you're an adult.
Virtually every state, almost 45 states, enacted laws cracking down on juvenile offenders, making it easier to prosecute youth in adult criminal courts.
Same time the laws were being enacted, juvenile crime rates were already starting to show a surprising trend.
Juvenile crime rates have been plummeting during this period of time in the wake of this panic.
The drop in juvenile crime has been attributed to many things: a stronger economy, better policing, a decline in crack cocaine use. But DiIulio's research had not foreseen any of these trends.
We were at on the precipice of being able to explain and predict all kinds of things, poverty trends, crime trends, and so forth. None of that work, none of those predictions in any of those fields have borne fruit.
By the late 1990s, after a steady decline in juvenile crime, DiIulio could see just how mistaken he was. The super predator was a no-show.
The predictions were off by a factor of 4. It had doubled and it was supposed to double again, and instead it was halved. Right? And so that's about as far off as one could. The super predator idea was wrong. Once it was out there, though, it was out there. There was no reeling it in.
It was a myth. And unfortunately, it was a myth that some academics jumped onto. The fear over the super predator led to a tremendous number of laws and policies that we're just now recovering from.
Automatic mandatory life sentences, the justices said, amount to cruel and unusual punishment.
So both state, federal, and international law recognizes that treating youth offenders as adults is unjust, inhumane, and ineffective. And the people who came up with the theory that this should be are saying that they're wrong and admitting they're wrong. Then why have we not implemented the appropriate changes to policy? We urge New York State specifically to stop mandating all 16 and 17-year-old offenders to adult prison